I'm pretty confident that every person once in their life heard a phrase like must-read classics or 100 essential books you have to read before your 20s, right? It is considered that there is a number of books that are essential and that every person had to read. And most of them are classics. I'm a person who loves a good classic, but I am not sure that I have read all of them, and I'm in a search for some new good classic books. That's why I decided to establish once and for all how many classics have I actually read and how many classics have I skipped or even pretended that I've read, because there's been times where I haven't been quite honest. So I thought that today we're gonna have a cozy book chat with a cup of coffee, taking a penguin book quiz called How Many Classics Have You Read? To see whether I am competent or not to recommend you any classics. Also, this might be a video that might inspire you to read more classics or suggest new classic recommendations, because I am not sure that everyone knows where to begin with classics. I think it will be a great opportunity to find new classics for yourself and perhaps battle your fear of classic books. Anyway, let's not ramble any longer. Get your coffee. Let's have some fun. Let's take that quiz, chat about some books. First book, Pride and Prejudice. I've read Pride and Prejudice, but it was when I was pretty young. I think I was 12, and so I didn't really appreciate it. But I've read this one. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I read this one for my school program and also when I was 9. I don't know why I decided to read that book when I was 9, because I didn't really quite even understand all of the social context, because I just didn't have the knowledge. Reading that when I was 9, interesting idea, but I reread it last year for my English literature class. Great Gatsby, of course I've read it. Next book is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I read this one during summer and I actually made a video about it, about the books I've read in June, and I quite loved it. I remember I gave it 5 stars. It was a very enjoyable read, especially because I saw the play in a theater. Not only reading a book, but also seeing plays and interpretations make the reading experience much more vivid, and so that definitely helped. I love the atmosphere, although it took me a long time to read. I remember that. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I actually read this book, but I remember not quite enjoying it, but people love it. And so I think of rereading it, especially because now I'm older. I still have that copy of a book that I bought, so I might refresh my memory and read that. White Sargasso Sea by Jen Riss. This book has been on my reading list for such a long time, for a year now, I think, and I cannot find it in any bookstore. It's a miss on my part, and I definitely should read it, and that's why I added to my to-be-read list. So this is the first one I haven't read here. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Here's the thing, so if you know me, you know I love a good Huxley book, but for some reason, Brave New World is one of those books that I just cannot force myself to start reading. And I've read 3 books by Huxley, 3 of them. I've read Eyeless and Gaza, I've read The Antic Hay. Brave New World is just one of those classics that doesn't really spark my interest. I am not a lover of dystopian novels. I read George Orwell, and of course I appreciated the 1984, and I think it is an essential book. But if I was to choose between a dystopian novel and a regular novel, I would definitely choose a regular novel. So Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is one of those books I haven't read. I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. Didn't even hear about that one. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I've read it. I didn't quite like it. Not my cup of tea, but I've read it. Next book is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Of course I've read it. Of course. If you haven't read any Russian classic, please do. I'm a lover of Russian classics. I mostly read Nabokov, and also one of my favorite books is by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's called The Gambler. Most of the people haven't heard about The Gambler Gambler. I suggest you read that because Crime and Punishment is pretty popular, but no one has read The Gambler, and I think it's a miss. Next book, The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and of course I read that one. This one is an essential, in my opinion. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. I haven't read that one, and I don't even know what it's about. Persuasion by Jane Austen. You know me, I love Jane Austen, but I didn't hear anything about Persuasion. That's a miss on my part. Les Misérables, Victor Hugo. A classic. Like, literally a classic. I had to read this in 4ème, which is like a 4th grade. Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And that's another one of those books that I'm going to say that I've read, but actually haven't read and won't, because I refuse to. I refuse to subject myself to that suffering. I am not mentally prepared. So this one will remain on my to-be-read list. Next on this list is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. And this one is one of those books that I want to read and cannot wait to read, but just didn't have a chance to lay my hands on. I love Virginia Woolf. She's one of my favorite writers. One of my favorite books is The Waves, and Orlando is fabulous. So her books are my cup of tea. But To the Lighthouse, I still haven't had a chance to read it. That's a mistake on my part. I should order it. The Death of the Heart by Elizabeth Bowen. Never heard of that one. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I've read it. I'm not a fan of those type of novels. I don't know, something about scientific progress or, as I said, dystopian style of writing doesn't really pique my interest. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. This one I will reread forever and ever. And just in general, I think Mikhail Bulgakov should be read twice or even thrice, because there are different levels to understanding his writing and to actually plunging into it and diving into it. There's a lot of biblical study that has to be done before reading The Master and Margarita, and I think reducing it to a woman who is just flying around naked is quite superficial. And yes, I consider this a brilliant classic and the one you definitely have to read if you haven't. The next book on the list is The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, and I haven't read that one and I haven't heard about that one. So far we're doing okay, I would say. The Iliad by Homer. Haven't read that one. However, I've read extracts from it for my literature class, as well as the analysis by Simone Weil, which is called The Iliad or the Poem of Forks, and I enjoyed it. But in the full version, I have not read that book. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Casey. No. 1984 by George Orwell. Yes. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Yes. I remember reading it for the first time when I was 13, and I remember I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't understand it, and I found the character very unlikable, and I was that type of reader who needed a character to be likable at some point to really enjoy the book. I am no longer that type of a person. I reread this book when I was 15, and I found it more enjoyable. Perhaps because I was going through that period of adolescence where you're kind of against everyone in the world and you need your literature choices and your movie choices and the media you consume in general to support this rebellious point of view. And I think if I was to reread it now, I would have a different opinion on the book. So I enjoyed it when I was 15, but I didn't quite love it, and I didn't enjoy it at all when I was 13. Beloved by Toni Morrison. This is tricky because this is the book I start reading today, actually, which is a coincidence. I don't know. If I start reading it, I don't know. I will take it. The Code of the Wusses by P.G. Wodehouse. Didn't even hear about that book. Dracula by Bram Stoker. Did not read this one. The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. Did not read this one. The Chrysalids by John Wyndham. Who are these people? What are these books? Like, I mean, I've heard about The Outsiders and about the Dracula, but I haven't heard about the Chrysalids. What is this? War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. One of my major achievements is finishing this beast last year. I read it in its entirety and it was a fabulous read. Wouldn't say I enjoyed the descriptions of a tree that lasted 10 pages, but definitely a must read, especially if you enjoy Russian classics. I feel like there are two camps, people who love Dostoevsky and people who love Leo Tolstoy, and I'm more of a Dostoevsky girly, but I've read War and Peace. Did not read Great Expectations, not planning to. Another Country by James Baldwin. This one I ordered and it's about to come in mail, and I cannot wait to start on this one because you know me, I love a good James Baldwin book. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Did not read it. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wood. For some reason, this is one of those books that I'm just afraid of even starting. Don't know why, but even the title scares me. At some point, I will have to read it, so it will take me some courage, but I will read it. Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Middlemarch by George Eliot. I haven't heard about that one. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. God, I love Daphne du Maurier. I love her books. I've read The House on a Strand, Rebecca, My Cousin Rachel, The Breaking Point, which is her short story collection. I'm a lover of a good Daphne du Maurier book. I think she was a brilliant writer and every piece of her writing is worth reading. So if you haven't read any of her books, read them. They're whimsical, funny, and playful. And at the same time, they're lyrical. I just love them. Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. God, that sounds scary. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. And this one, I'm proud to say I read not once, but 2 times. 2 times. Why? God knows, but I was bored. Red's Head Revisited by Evelyn Vaughan. I've read it, I enjoyed it, I've talked about it at length in my spring classics you have to read. So if you haven't watched that one, I suggest you go and watch it. We have a fun time there. I love me a good Evelyn Vaughan book. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Read it. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Nope. Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. Huh? What is that book? Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. I've read this book and I just loved everything about it. And the way it was a very innovative piece at the time, and even now it is relevant. It is quite descriptive. It's just a book that doesn't get old, I feel like. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Watched the movie, didn't read the book. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I just finished that book and I'm about to make a video about this book and I loved every single page of it. I think I might have loved it even more than I loved The East of Eden. I might have. That's for another video. Ulysses by James Joyce. Read it. East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Read it last summer and absolutely fell in love with John Steinbeck. It was my first John Steinbeck novel and it was one of those novels that I just was so afraid of starting. Perhaps even more afraid than starting The Age of Innocence. But it's such a good read. As I said, John Steinbeck is one of those authors that I'm able to come to and lose myself in his prose and in his lyricism and just in his approach of life. He's incredible. The Lord of the Rings. Read it, but like when I was 8. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I have read that book. It's a lengthy book. It captures so many ideas and so many personalities. Every character is so brilliantly depicted. I also saw a play of that book and it just really mocked me. Loved that book even more than I did Crime and Punishment. But my favorite is The Gambler. Bud Brooks by Thomas Mann. Haven't read that one. Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Here's the thing. This is one of those books that I just cannot approach. I don't know why. I've read lots of books by Vladimir Nabokov. I've read like maybe 6 to 10 books, but Lolita, even if it's his most famous book to this date, but I feel like I have this prejudice against a book that is widely discussed. It has been the center of discussion for ages now, if not for a whole century. And I feel like I just grew tired of hearing about it constantly, but at some point I will have to read it and have my own opinion. The Secret Garden by Frances Hudson Burnett. I've read it. Scoop by Evelyn Waugh. I've read it, but the thing is, I read it in French and I very much want to read it in English, because when the book is translated, you're kind of unable to enjoy it in the same way you would be able to enjoy it when it's in its original language. So I've read Scoop by Evelyn Waugh. I loved it, but I would love to reread that book. Love in a Cold Climate by Nancy Mitford. Haven't heard of that one. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Nope. Diary of a Nobody by George Grossmith and Whedon Grossmith. These are brothers, am I right? Anyway, I haven't heard about that book, but it sounds interesting. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I've read that one, but I still enjoy Dostoevsky more. The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni. Haven't heard of that one. Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Read it and talked about it at length in my Spring Classics video. Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. The Time Machine by Wells. I've read this one, but as I said, I'm not a fan of dystopian novels and novels about science and technological progress. Not really my cup of tea, so I didn't quite enjoy it, but I have read it. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Nope. The Forsyte Saga by John Galsworthy. So many people love this saga, but I feel like I'm scared of even starting it because it is so long. Like, it's multiple books. I'm not sure that I have the time right now in my life to start a family saga. Maybe during the summer holidays I will have time eventually and I will read it. Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck. This one I didn't even hear of. A book by John Steinbeck that I haven't heard of. That's wild. Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller. Read it, borrowed it from a library, received very weird glances from the book lady, and was quite traumatized, but in a very good way. Staying On by Paul Scott. Haven't read it. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Graham. Yes. The Quiet American by Graham Greene. No. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I've read it, and if you know me, and if you watched a number of videos on this channel, I am not a fan of Wuthering Heights. In fact, this book was one of the reasons why I was afraid of classics and why I haven't read a lot of classics for a pretty long time. So I'm kind of prejudiced. Perfume by Patrick Susskind. I have it right there. I read it. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Of course I read it. It was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham. I haven't read that book. However, I read another book of his and I quite loved the writing style that he used. I was so indulged in that book. This is definitely a good book to add to my to-be-read list. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I haven't read anything by Charles Dickens. Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. One of my favorite books. Love it, love it, love it, love it. The Picture of Dorian Gray. Of course I read it. We studied it at school. I read it by myself. Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Listen, if it is by Charles Dickens, I haven't read it. Silas Marner by George Eliot. I haven't heard of it. Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I must say I read it after I've read The Waves because I was so impressed with Woolf's writing, and I also must say that I enjoyed The Waves more than I did enjoy Mrs. Dalloway. However, I love it. And finally, the last list of books, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Yes, I've talked about this book again in my Spring Classics video. The Sea by Iris Murdoch. Murdoch? Haven't read that one. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I am feeling guilty for not reading Charles Dickens. Why am I feeling like I'm being judged by Penguin Books for not reading Charles Dickens? The Castle by Franz Kafka. It is on my to-be read list. However, I read, of course, the Metamorphosis, and I also read The Process, and I very much enjoyed The Process, and in general, I love reading Franz Kafka's notebooks. I find them very calming and very reassuring. Claudius by Robert Graves. This one is on my to-be read list. I'm so excited about this book. However, the bookshop that I want to order it from, they don't have it, so I'm currently waiting for it to arrive there so that I will be able to order it. Anyway, the point I'm making is that I'm really excited to read it in the future. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I haven't heard of it. Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. The fact that I don't understand half of the words in this sentence is very scary to me. The Razor's Age by Somerset Maugham. Another book that I need to read. It is on my to-be read list. Lot Cries to Kendall Ford by Flora Thompson. Haven't heard of it. The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Also haven't heard of it. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. One of my favorite books ever. I found that the lyrical descriptions were magnetic and majestic. I think James Joyce he's at his peak when writing this book, because this will remain one of my favorite novels ever, and I just remember clinging to the book during the nights and during my classes. I read this book during my math class, which truly shows how much of an artist I am, and definitely not a scientific person, but I just love that book. If you haven't read that one, you miss out on a lot more than you think. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. Didn't even hear of that book. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This perhaps is a book that I enjoyed. One of the dystopian novels that I actually enjoyed. I love a good Margaret Atwood novel. At some point in my life, perhaps when I was 16, I very much indulged in lots of books, and The Robert's Bride was one of my favorite books when I was 16. It no longer is, because I reread it and didn't find it as enjoyable as I did when I was 16, but the fact is, I love Margaret Atwood. The Handmaid's Tale is a classic, and the Hulu adaptation is a must-watch. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I've read it, I enjoyed it. I think though that there are better books by James Baldwin to be read. For example, The Fire Next Time is a brilliant book, and one of those books that I'm not going to stop talking about. The Godfather by Mary Puzo. I actually read that one quite recently because I watched the TV series about how this book was made into a movie, and the TV show is called The Offer, if I'm not mistaken. It shot so beautifully. I loved it, and that's why I decided to read The Godfather, because I actually haven't read it. And also because I was watching The White Lotus, they talked quite a lot about The Godfather, so that was why I also decided to read that book, and I enjoyed it. Not my favorite, but definitely a good book to pick up during the weekend. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Haven't read that one. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I've heard quite a lot about this book, and I think of adding this book to my reading list because I've heard it's very good, and I try to educate myself on different literature, especially the one in translation. I think reading translated literature is very important. I love reading in different languages. I will add this book to my reading list, however, I didn't read it. White Nights by Dostoevsky. No comments. I read it. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. No comments here either. You already know the answer. 46 out of 100. Wow. I have a lot of catching up to do during summer holidays. Evidently. I thought to myself that I read much less of classic books, if I'm being honest. Now I'm feeling kind of judged, if you know what I mean. Like, I'm not competent enough to talk about books. But there are a lot of contemporary novels that I read and I enjoy. And I just feel like your book taste cannot be defined by reading classic books. There's so much more books to enjoy and discover besides classic books. I kind of feel the urge to defend myself here. I haven't read even half of them. There's only 46 books that I've read out of 100. I should educate myself. Anyway, I hope you found new books to read, and I hope this video inspired you to read more classics. Let's educate ourselves this year together. Let's read more classic books in 2025. If you find yourself not enjoying classic books, that's totally fine. There's so many beautiful novels that are coming out. Thank you for having fun with me. Let me know what is your favorite classic, and I'm going to leave the link in the description for this quiz, and let me know how many books have you read out of these classics. Hopefully you enjoyed our little chat as much as I did. As always, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I wish you all the best, and bye.